Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening a fascinating and, frankly, a pretty unsettling file. We're going to be looking at a declassified medical report that treats consciousness not as some philosophical mystery, but as a physical process. And if it's a physical process, well, that means it could theoretically be hacked.
So, let's just dive right in with the central question that this entire report, both the medical and the military side of it, really revolves around. I mean, it's a question that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction, but it's one that researchers have been taking very seriously for decades.
And boom, here's our entry point. This absolutely startling claim comes from Dr. John Norcine, a scientist who was working for the defense giant Lockheed Martin. And he wasn't speaking in metaphors here. He was describing a proposed technology, a way to literally write a thought right into someone else's mind. So how on earth did Norcine think this was even possible? Well, it all starts with this idea he called a code for consciousness, the notion that our thoughts, our awareness, they all have a specific, and more importantly, a readable structure. This is a preserved slide from his research, and it gives us this incredibly rare glimpse into his whole framework. Now, what's really interesting here is that he didn't see the brain as just, a wet biological computer. No, he saw it as a type of interferometer, a device that uses waves to process information holographically. He basically believed our brain doesn't just compute with ones and zeros. It uses these complex, interfering wave patterns to create the rich, dynamic reality we all experience in our minds. So this brings us to the crucial point, this thing he called quantum shift keying, or QSK for short. The best way to think about it is like a programming language for the brain. Norcine believed that if you knew the specific code, if you had the right key, you could unlock the brain's entire operating system and write new information directly onto the hard drive.
But, for any code to work, it needs a computer to run on. So where in the brain's incredibly complex anatomy would this quantum language even be processed? Well, the report points to a tiny, and I mean tiny, piece of our fundamental biological hardware.
Norcine's research, and he was drawing on the work of others here, identifies these structures, microtubules. You can think of them as the protein skeletons inside our cells. They're the scaffolding that gives our neurons their shape. But this theory suggests they do so much more. What if they're the actual quantum processors we've been looking for?
And he used this incredibly vivid analogy to explain it. He described memories as being captured from the very energy of empty space, what physicists call zero-point energy, which is kind of like this background hum of the universe that's everywhere. He says, think of it like winding up the rubber band on a toy airplane. A signal comes in, it releases the memory, and then the protein just rewinds itself ready to be used all over again.
All right, let's get into the grand theory that really underpins all of this. It's a pretty radical idea from Nobel laureate Sir Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff, and it's called orchestrated objective reduction. It's a mouthful, I know. Now, this is a fundamental challenge to how we usually think about quantum mechanics. For almost a century, we've been told that a quantum particle can be in many places at once, and it only chooses one spot when a conscious person, an observer, looks at it. But this OR theory says, nope. It says gravity itself is the arbiter of reality, no observer required. And this diagram does a great job of showing how it might work. So imagine a particle is in two places at the same time. Well, according to Einstein, any mass curves space-time. So that one little particle is actually creating two slightly different curvatures in the fabric of reality, two parallel space-time histories, just existing side by side. And this slide shows the climax, the magic moment. That separation between those two space-times, it can't last forever. When it reaches a critical point, a threshold that's defined by gravity, the whole superposition becomes unstable, and it collapses into a single, defined state. And according to Penrose and Hameroff, every single one of those collapses is a moment of proto-consciousness, a tiny spark of awareness. And they even have a formula for it. Now, don't worry about the symbols. The key takeaway is actually pretty simple. The equation basically shows that the bigger the object is, the faster reality is forced to make a choice. A tiny electron can hang out in that quantum weirdness for a long time, but something huge, like Schrödinger's cat, would have its fate decided almost instantly, just by the force of gravity alone.
Okay, so let's bring this all back down to Earth. If consciousness really is a physical process, something governed by gravity and quantum mechanics, then how could you actually measure it? Or better yet, how could you influence it? The report actually details Norcine's proposed toolkit for doing just that.
And he wasn't being vague about the physics either.
He pointed to 3 specific, real-world phenomena as the keys to interacting with the brain's quantum state. This is how you'd turn the theory into a potential technology.
Okay, first up, the Zeeman effect. It's a well-known thing in physics, where magnetic fields mess with light. Norsine believed you could use this like a high-tech scanner to map the brain's internal magnetic signals with incredible precision. This would be the key to reading a thought.
Second, the Casimir effect. This is where all that quantum weirdness actually becomes a real, measurable force. And it's generated from that same vacuum energy we talked about earlier. He linked this directly to the tiny gaps between our brain cells, suggesting this quantum force actually plays a role in generating our brain waves. And finally, Alphen waves. Now this one is pretty wild. Norsine saw these as a kind of universal grid of magnetic strings. He theorized that tiny particles of magnetite, which is a naturally magnetic mineral found in all of our brains, could act like little antennas, connecting us to this grid. This could allow for communication that isn't limited by physical distance, the potential mechanism for writing a thought.
Now, what's really interesting here is that Norsine wasn't some lone wolf researcher just cooking this up on his own. This report shows his work is part of a long, pretty shadowy history of military and intelligence interest in remotely influencing the human mind.
For instance, the source describes these Soviet military tests from way back in the Cold War. A specific unit, 71592, was reportedly experimenting with remote biological influence, and some of the claims were pretty incredible, like having the ability to put an entire enemy military unit to sleep from a distance.
And don't think this is all just dusty Cold War history. More recent research confirms that these kinds of technologies, while probably rare, have not just been stuck in a laboratory. According to some researchers, they have been used in real-world intelligence and military operations.
And here it is. Here's the proof from our own intelligence community. This is a declassified CIA file from 1991. It's an analysis of Russian tech that the inventor claimed could impair a person's logic from a distance and, get this, weigh human thought to within 10 to the minus 35 grams. Just unbelievable.
You see, this research didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The report traces this direct line from pre-World War II research in Germany, through the absorption of German scientists into the Soviet nuclear program, all the way to secret projects pursued at the highest levels of the Soviet state, and then, finally, to the interest of Western intelligence as that whole state collapsed. And all of this brings us to the final, really unsettling takeaway from this entire report. It's a question that just kind of hangs in the air long after you close the file. If the human mind truly operates on these physical principles, then the race to understand and influence it might just be the most consequential arms race in human history.